After nearly 2 decades of helping to shape the future of car culture through its philanthropic efforts, Hagerty created an overarching nonprofit organization called the Hagerty Drivers Foundation. The foundation provides scholarships for students in the automotive field of education, offers financial support for young people to obtain driver's education through the License to the Future grants, and continues to build the National Historic Vehicle Register, which documents the invaluable and endearing history of our automotive past. By way of introduction, we have Casey Maxon, Senior Manager of Heritage at the Hagerty Drivers Foundation. As an automotive historian and photographer, Casey manages various aspects of the Foundation's programming, which consists of 3 core elements: anything that celebrates automotive culture, anything that funds research on the environmental implications and the economic impact of collector vehicles, and any initiatives that would seek to build up the next generation of enthusiasts. Casey helped develop and now oversees the National Historic Vehicle Register. Launched in 2014, the Register program, administered by the Hagerty Drivers Foundation in partnership with the Department of the Interior's Heritage Documentation programs, ensures that the history of the cars that we love, those notable cars, live on for generations to come. Casey, welcome to Automoblog. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Carl. Excited to chat with you.
Yeah. Casey, what prompted us to reach out to you and your team to ask for this interview is that at the end of June 2023, the Hagerty Drivers Foundation released the Chrysler Turbine car Engineering a Revolution. And we'll leave a link below to this. It's available for free on the Hagerty Drivers Foundation YouTube channel. But the film captures the dynamic story behind the people who, at the time, really rewrote the rules of automotive design. And everything in your documentary there is direct from the vantage point of the engineers and the mechanics who oversaw the original Turbine cars program, and then perspective then from the historians who are working to preserve and share its legacy. So Casey, let's just start with that. And let me just tell you how much I loved that documentary.
That is so great to hear. You know, we hope that these projects and these documentary films that we put out there do just that. They inspire folks, they get people excited about our automotive past.
Yeah. Casey, that week, it was released at the end of June 2023. And that week we were going into 4th of July, a long 4th of July weekend. I was taking some time off. And I said, I need something over July 4th weekend to really reignite my passion for the automobile. Because this is the thing, we're car enthusiasts, but we all have full-time jobs, and it's easy to lose that passion as you go through the day-to-day. And so I said, you know what? I knew this Hagerty documentary was out, and I said, 4th of July weekend, I'm going to take some time, watch it. And Casey, it did not disappoint. I went back to work after 4th of July with a completely re-energized, reinvigorated passion for cars.
That's awesome. That is really cool to hear.
Let's talk about, I want to talk more about the films because there's another one on the Hudson Hornet, but give us an overview first. Give us a perspective on the Hagerty Drivers Foundation, some of the work you do, and the purpose behind the foundation.
Absolutely. So the foundation is Hagerty's nonprofit arm, the philanthropic arm of Hagerty, the company. And it was founded, with a number of goals in mind, but really to save our automotive heritage, save our automotive culture, and pass it on to the next generation, right? To save driving, get young people involved in the car hobby, and make sure that, 50, 100, 200 years from now, there's still people out there that can work on these cars, that appreciate them, that love them, and that these stories continue to be told. And so we do that through a number of programs. You mentioned some of those in the introduction, like our National Historic Vehicle Register, where we document vehicles, much like buildings have been documented with the National Register of Historic Places, or other engineering structures through the Historic American Engineering Record, or all these programs that have been administered at a federal level with the Library of Congress and other aspects of our federal government to really save our heritage. There's a number of universities that have preservation programs that focus on buildings and bridges and you name it. But there hasn't been much done systematically to save our automotive culture. And we've kind of looked at cars as utilitarian we have a wonderful automotive hobby with millions of enthusiasts and car shows. The Pebble Beach Concours just happened, where you had automotive history and automotive heritage preserved at the highest level, but in a kind of systematic academic way. We haven't looked to save that history and pass it on. And so in 2014, what was at the time the Historic Vehicle Association, that's now the Drivers Foundation, went out and established this program called the National Historic Vehicle Register to do just that. Let's save this history and make sure we can pass it down. And that's just one aspect of how we do it. We also want to find ways to really get young people involved, right? So we give scholarships for people that are in the field of automotive restoration or automotive preservation, young technicians that are looking to put their hands on these cars and make sure that they have the skills to save them. And then on top of that, we give grants out to young people that are looking to get their driver's license, because it's no longer necessarily something that schools offer. It's become very expensive. So we want to make sure that people can get behind the wheel, young people especially, and get the proper training. And then we're also looking into really taking a look at, okay, let's be the thought leaders here on what is the environmental impact of classic cars and the use of classic cars, and put some real rigor behind studying that.
Yeah. Casey, let's go at all of that just one at a time here. I had the privilege of having you on my podcast recently, and I'll leave a link to that below. One of the things you said in the podcast that I thought really stood out is you said that YouTube is similar to the Library of Congress, where there's an availability there to really get that message out about automotive history. That was part of the inspiration behind the Chrysler Turbine car documentary, and then now the fabulous Hudson Hornet documentary, which followed just less than a month later, right on the heels of the Turbine car documentary. Another fantastic piece of work there. But Casey, talk about your viewpoint there, the relationship between YouTube and the documentaries, and why it's important, why YouTube's a good avenue with these documentaries to get that history out there.
Yeah, the purpose behind these documentaries, it's not just entertainment, right? Like, we want you to be entertained, certainly, but we're trying to teach the history of the automobile in the US, the cultural history of the automobile. And YouTube is this wonderful platform that's free and available to the entire public. Anybody can access this, and we want people to see these documentaries, and we don't want there to be a barrier of entry, right? The Library of Congress is similar in that way. The masses can see this, experience it, and then it's preserved and archived long into the future. And so when we started looking at, okay, how are we going to get these stories out there? How do we cement the heritage and the significance of these vehicles and make sure that people actually have access to them? It's not squirreling it away in some archive. It's getting it out to the public. And YouTube is such a great platform for that.
Yeah. Again, the Chrysler Turbine car, Engineering a Revolution, and the fabulous Hudson Hornet, links below to the Hagerty Drivers Foundation YouTube channel for both of those documentaries. Casey, when you're creating these documentaries and you're looking ahead, how do you decide what films you're going to make? How do you decide what cars you're going to feature in your YouTube presentations?
So the documentaries are part of the National Historic Vehicle Register program, right? So we don't just produce the documentaries independent of vehicles that are going on the register. We produce them as we are recording cars for the Library of Congress. And so based on which cars are being added to the register and scheduling of that year is how we dictate, what documentary production looks like.
In the documentaries, let's go to the Chrysler Turbine car documentary. Mark Olson's story is just incredible and something that resonated with me. For our viewers watching this, I won't give away the story, but Mark Olson's family ends up with a Chrysler Turbine car in the 1960s as part of the marketing and PR blitz. What is it like to be there firsthand with somebody like Mark Olson, who this Chrysler Turbine car, had such a dramatic impact on his life? What's that like to be there with him on set?
It was truly inspirational. I mean, we look at this car, you learn the history of the Chrysler Turbine, and you think, as our title kind of implies, engineering a revolution. It's all about the nuts and bolts and the horsepower behind these cars and the sheet metal. And then you learn the story of somebody like Mark Olson, and you realize the impact that automobiles have on our lives, the impact that automobiles have on our culture, and what they can do to us, and the sort of relationship that we then have. And seeing Mark's story is just incredible, and understanding the sort of passion that he then devoted the rest of his life towards the automobile, and then has since become one of the preeminent caretakers of the Chrysler Turbine story, that when somebody is researching it, they go to his website to find out more information, that he has kind of amassed all of these records that will ensure that this story lives on for decades and decades to come. I mean, we couldn't have done this documentary without a lot of people, Steve Leto and so many others, the stalls that own this car, but Mark Olson, what he was able to provide to us with contacts to engineers and other folks that were involved in the story was just remarkable.
We'll leave a link below in the description to Mark Olson's website, turbinecar.com. I get goosebumps just thinking about it right now. That to me was he to me, everybody was an amazing guest in that documentary, but I almost teared up when he's talking about being in school, being a geek, not fitting in, but he was a car person. And I think so many of us in this hobby can relate to that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think our entire crew we were all bawling our eyes out during his interview. I mean, it was truly an honor to sit down and record his story.
Yeah. And then we move over to the story of Al Schultz and his grandson, Alan, who's on the autism spectrum. He sees this Hudson Hornet car and he says, I've got to have it because my grandson, Alan, loves the movie Cars and the Doc Hudson character voiced by the late Paul Newman. Casey, again, what's it like to meet people like Al Schultz who, like you said, they're not just sheet metal. These cars have real meaning to people like that.
Yeah, the cars have soul and the stories have a soul to them. And like meeting Al was amazing to hear how he built this connection with his grandson around the Pixar movie Cars, but also the cars themselves. Mm-hmm. One of the neat things that we learned when talking to Al and in our interviews with him sitting down, he wasn't necessarily a car collector or a car guy before this all happened with his grandson. And this brought him into the hobby and brought him close to automobiles. And to learn, again, what we're all about is connecting beyond the horsepower. It's not about the horsepower. It's about the people that are involved with the story and what cars mean to us. And that this passion that you almost can't even explain, right? It's understanding that these cars speak to us in a way. And what's funny about it is in the movie Cars, they literally are speaking to us, right? So, and it meant so much that he then embarked on this journey with his grandson to own this car, to present it and have it on display for years to come for other young people to build that connection with.
With everyone from, say, Al Schultz to Mark Olson to all of the historians and authors and celebrities like Jay Leno who appear in these documentaries. Casey, behind the scenes, how do you get everything lined up? How do you organize all this and get all these guests together in one place so you can do the filming?
So, honestly, that's one of the most fun aspects of it, other than driving the cars, right? Sure. When we're filming them driving.
Sure.
It takes quite a bit of time. These were long productions, some of the longest productions we've ever done with the foundation. And what we'll do is we do a considerable amount of research. Obviously, these are part of our National Register program. So it's not just something that we go out and start filming, right? We put a lot of work into building outlines, storyboards, talking to the experts like Steve Leto or Mark Olson, Al Schultz, Ed Sowers, people that know these cars inside and out. The people that are in the documentaries are often, we look for the experts, the subject matter experts, to get their opinions on who we need to film. And a lot of times we might set an interview schedule and say, okay, these are the folks we're going to film. This is who we need to have. This person will represent this aspect of the story. And then we'll start talking to them, sit them down in an interview, and they'll say, you know what? You really need to talk to so-and-so. you need to talk to so-and-so. And that's how we ended up filming, if not to give away too much of the Chrysler Turbine project, but there's a lot going on with Jay Leno's car right now. And that was how we ended up finding out about that, was through sitting down and actually filming the interviews. And we were told, oh, you need to talk to Jay and you need to find out Steve Leto's brother. You need to talk to him and hear what's going on there. And the work to save one of the running turbine cars, because there aren't that many, and the technology is obsolete, and that history is it's in danger. So we need to save it. And learning those stories and kind of, we have to allow some flexibility in our interview schedule. Sure. It's a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of work tracking all that down.
Casey, the Hagerty Drivers Foundation does such a wonderful job with the guests, and then all of the stunning B-roll of the cars that you interlace between, the shots of the interviews. But you also do just a bang-up job with archival footage that really, in both films, Chrysler Turbine Car and the fabulous Hudson Hornet, that shows what's happening in the United States at the time. And in the Hudson documentary, you have archival footage of Tom Rhoades. Tom Rhoades is a former PR director for the Hudson Motor Car Company. And the exchange in the archival footage with Tom Rhoades is just hilarious. They had no idea the winner that they were sitting on.
Yeah, that was one of these just incredible finds that came through the process of creating that film. And it was actually from our producer and editor reached out to an archivist at NASCAR. And they had that in their archives, and it was like just such an amazing find, because you hear about the Hudson story, right? You learn about how it was this kind of underdog in the car world at the time. Hudson, they were up against the big three in the post-war era, where cars were selling like hotcakes, and they were doing everything they could to stay alive against Ford, Chevy, Chrysler. And they had this unsuspecting winner in the Hudson Hornet. And then they kind of leveraged that. They were one of the first companies in the post-war era to really look at win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And you hear those stories, you learn that concept that Hudson got involved in that, but to hear it firsthand from the former PR director that literally was on the phone with NASCAR saying, I don't know if we should do anything about this. And NASCAR's like, you should really be like advertising the fact that your cars are winning and maybe sponsor a team. And in doing so, Hudson became one of the first OEMs to actually have a factory-backed team in NASCAR and set that precedent. It's really incredible that NASCAR had that archival interview. And we couldn't be more thankful to have been able to include that.
Casey, with these documentaries being available for free on the Hagerty Drivers Foundation YouTube channel, we are in an era now of preserving automotive history, especially through mediums like YouTube and the Library of Congress. But in the automotive industry itself, especially here in Detroit where we're at, there is a lot of talk daily of electrification, software-defined cars, even autonomous driving. And where does this leave us then as traditional car enthusiasts? Are we going to get replaced? If the gasoline engine phases out, what happens to us? What happens to our hobby? Is there still room for us? What's your perspective on all of that?
I think there's still plenty of room for us. There's millions of internal combustion engine cars out there, and we've gone through all sorts of changes over the decades with cars. And, I think one of the really important things to say about that is, in times of major change, it's good to look at kind of what came before us, right? And so I think that it kind of underlines the importance of what we're doing with the National Historic Vehicle Register to document where the automobile came from in the last effectively 120 years or so of the automobile in this country, and what that looked like, and what the kind of development and the cultural and social impacts of the car manifested itself over our history. And things like the Chrysler Turbine car, that it could have revolutionized everything. And understanding those stories, here was a car that could have run on tequila, any type of fuel possible. And so understanding all of that is really important, and documenting that history.
Casey, this next question that I'm going to ask is going to probably seem really obvious, but just go with it here. Again, especially in an era of electrification and software-defined cars, why is it essential? Why is it essential that we preserve our automotive history like this?
I think a good way to look at this, right, is you mentioned the story of Mark Olson. If you watch the Turbine car documentary and you understand how meaningful this automobile was to his life, when we think of our material culture and the history of this nation, what has defined so many people's lives and has shaped so much of our culture, right? It's the automobile. And to not look at that as something that needs to be preserved in a systematic way to be passed on to the next generation, we really need to do that because it is truly part of what has made this country what it is.
On the Hagerty Drivers Foundation website, links below as well to this, you have an area called Leading the Conversation, which does touch on some of these more future topics, which lists things like environmental research and alternative fuels. Casey, what's the foundation's focus in that regard?
So we're kind of new to this area, but we're looking at how we can begin to start funding some research behind the environmental impact of the automobile, the classic car primarily, and look at what that looks like and really lead the conversation on that.
Yeah. And then in addition to that, you've got grants and initiatives that are ongoing to build up the next generation of car enthusiasts. You also mentioned driver's education. Casey, what's the focus there then for the foundation?
So, we really want to make sure that there are young people that have access to this culture, this industry, and this hobby. And we do that through a number of initiatives. Our License to the Future program, where I mentioned earlier, we actually give grants to individual young people that are looking to get their driver's license. A lot of schools no longer offer that programming. So we step up to the plate and say, here's a grant for up to $500. Put it towards your driver's education program. And we've actually funded, by the time the program is closed for this year, which we've hit our application limit and we're just finalizing some of that, we'll have funded over 300 young people to get their driver's license this year alone.
It's amazing.
We've been absolutely inundated with applicants, far more than we could ever imagine and far more than we had in the past. So there's certainly the passion that's still out there. People understand how important it is and want to partake in getting their driver's license.
That's amazing, Casey. And I had only recently learned that it's not as available through schools anymore. Where I grew up, it was just the summer before you turned 16, it was a given. You went to a school-sponsored driver's ed,
Yep.
drove through the cones, drove on the highway, merged with traffic, parallel parked. I was shocked that had changed, really shocked.
Yeah, I mean, we see costs anywhere from $300, $200, all the way up to $700 to $1,000 for these private driving schools. And a lot of times that's a student's only option. So we want to make sure that they have access to good driver's education training.
Casey, the near future and the months ahead for the Hagerty Drivers Foundation, obviously the documentaries are incredible. What other work do you have coming up? Maybe other initiatives? What should we have our eyes open for in the near future from the foundation?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked. So we didn't stop the National Register program with the Chrysler Turbine or the Hudson Hornet. This year we've added 2 new cars to the register, a 1937 Cord. It was Amelia Earhart's last car. It was a Cord 812 that she bought in 1936 and drove around before she went off on her final flight, unfortunately. But that car still remains. And then we put another car on, a 1952 Porsche America Roadster, which was one of the first factory-built Porsche race cars that was actually built for the U.S. market to try and compete here, especially in Southern California, and get their foot in the door. And that's why it has the nickname, the America Roadster. Both of those cars, as part of our National Register program, will be on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. next week. We kick off our annual event in Washington, D.C. amongst all the museums there on the National Mall, all the Smithsonian museums, to kind of bring America's smallest car museum to the people, right? There are millions of people that visit the National Mall each year, and we want to get this heritage out there. So we do it on YouTube, we do it in the Library of Congress, and then we do it in person in Washington, D.C. And so both of those cars will be on display one at a time from August 31st to September 11th. Each car will be on display for about 5 or 6 days. You can check out our website for more information about that.
Absolutely, Casey. We'll have a link below in the description. Before we say goodbye, Casey, and it's been so great to chat with you again, I want to go back to something you had said on the podcast that you did with me about how you were a recipient of a Hagerty scholarship before you were ever an employee of the foundation and of the company. Take us back to that. Walk us through what that was like.
Absolutely, yeah. So the foundation, we give out grants to schools and educational institutions to give scholarships, and that's part of a legacy from Hagerty, the company, giving scholarships all the way back since 2003. And when I was a student at McPherson College for automotive restoration and history, I actually received a grant from the Collectors Foundation, which we continue on in that tradition with the foundation. And it was incredible to understand that an organization, a company, and folks out in the industry were encouraging of young people and wanted to get young people involved in the car world and support their training and education.
Would you say that that's had an impact on your career today? Does that inspire you going forward with all the work you do now today, especially with things like the National Historic Vehicle Register and the driver's license programs? That has to inspire you, right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I want to continue that and be able to open the door for the next young person to continue after me and bring other folks into this hobby and preserve these cars that we all love.
Casey, you know, from all of us here at Automoblog, we so enjoy and appreciate the work that you do for the Hagerty Drivers Foundation, whether it's for the young people who would otherwise not have a driver's license or would maybe not otherwise have the means to get into this hobby, to the documentaries that you have that are just incredible. Keep up the good work, and let's have you back again in the near future, maybe when the next documentary comes out or the next big announcement that you have. We'll get you back on the channel, and we'll go through all this again. But thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us today, Casey.
Thanks, Carl, so much for having me.
Speaking with Casey Maxon, Senior Manager of Heritage at the Hagerty Drivers Foundation, joining us on Automoblog. Links below to the Hagerty Drivers Foundation website and YouTube channel, where you can find the 2 documentaries we talked about, the Chrysler Turbine car engineering a revolution and the fabulous Hudson Hornet. In Detroit, alongside Casey Maxon, on behalf of Automoblog, I'm Carl Anthony.